So I'd like to begin a series of talks on Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West, paradoxically by beginning with the essay of a postmodern philosopher, another one of these essays by Gianni Vattimo in Nihilism and Emancipation. And it's an essay in here entitled Liberty and Peace in the Postmodern Condition. And I always think it's fun to rub anathema thought systems up against each other to see what kind of friction results, see what kind of sparks come out of this. And my reading of this essay actually led me to decide to reread The Decline of the West, which I'm now going to go ahead and go through chapter by chapter as a result of reading this essay. In this essay, what Vattimo wants to know is, are there any better conditions for liberty and peace in postmodernity than there were in modernity? With modernity, we know what happened with World War II and the Holocaust and totalitarian systems and so forth. But are the conditions any better? Is what he wants to know. And the first thing he does then is he asks, we need to qualify what we mean by postmodernity versus modernity, what these terms mean. And he says, at first, we're actually hampered by the fact that we tend to understand postmodernity through the lens of the kind of historical thinking that characterized modernity as the newest new thing, and distinguishing postmodernity from a previous epoch. That kind of unilinear thinking in terms of dividing history up into stages is a type of thinking that was characteristic of modernity. And he says it's the type of thinking that's rendered completely obsolescent by postmodernity, in which such absolutist Unitarian visions of history with stages of either development toward greater progress, or as in the case of reactionaries, and I presume that he would think of Spengler as a reactionary, as a gradual decline toward things getting worse and worse. Either way, they are both characteristic of modernity and its sense of history as a unilinear decline or ascent. Either way, it still amounts to the same thing. With postmodernity, what we have is more or less the end of this kind of historical sensibility. We have the end of metaphysics, as Heidegger pronounced, and also the end of objective truths and foundationalist philosophical thought systems. And we have all these cultures now. We have a decline with decolonization. We have all these cultures now. We have the rise of the rest, India and China, and all these other cultures rising up who are no longer want to be thought of as potential candidates for conversion to the Western religion. And I would submit actually that they are, in a certain sense, in that the conversion of these cultures to Christianity has now been replaced by a conversion of them to the global religion of economic free trade and Western democratic ideals. I think that's actually a conversion, a missionary conversion that has replaced, imposed by the IMF and the World Bank and so forth, that has replaced the earlier Christian conversion. But that's a different argument. I don't want to get into that here. But nonetheless, we have all these other cultures to contend with, and so none of them can presume in the postmodern world to have any kind of access to an objective world order that privileges their perspective over the others, least of all, as has been the case in the unfolding of European thought, Europe itself, seeing itself as the center of history, as the final stage by which all the other cultures have to be measured as history's grand ultimate achievement. That kind of Eurocentric thinking, Vattimo wants to argue in this essay, is gone. And that's one of the main characteristics of postmodernity, is this lack of a unilinear model of history. And he says that Nietzsche in his Untimely Meditations has a better model in which he thought of the contemporary man, and Vattimo sees this as the ideal in this essay, the contemporary man as an individual who wanders about through an historical park, a theme park more or less, in which every exhibit is a different civilization, and the modern man evaluates these civilizations in aesthetic terms, the way that we would wander through a museum and we would see all the different art styles of the different cultures as essentially compatible, as different modes of access to different kinds of truth, different kinds of understanding of being, as Heidegger would put it. And so it's aesthetics rather than objective truth that should guide this man who wanders through this historical theme park. And so that becomes Vattimo's model, borrowing from Nietzsche, for what ought to be the case today. And then he says that Nietzsche's death of God, Nietzsche pronounced the death of God in the middle of the 19th century, actually is tantamount to what the death of God really meant was the death of foundationalist truths. the death of this historical type of sensibility of seeing history in terms of these stages, these grand meta-narratives that Lyotard pronounced the death of. So he moves on to talk about how living in the age of the disintegration of foundationalist truth systems, is there any way that we can have a peace not based on foundationalist truth systems? And he thinks that we can, insofar as we retrieve Nietzsche's model of the Superman, but not the Superman as it's commonly misunderstood, as a model of a kind of social Darwinism, a kind of Superman, a blonde beast, or a great Aryan, as the Nazis caricaturized him. But rather understand the Superman in terms of the man who could, who is in possession of his critical faculties to such a degree that he can, with a sense of irony, self-irony about the way in which he interprets these cultures, can interpret them with a certain detachment and a certain relativism regarding them, each one of them as different from the others and as historically conditioned thought forms, but not as in any sense analyzing them from an absolute perspective in which the individual, the Superman, has access to some privileged set of truths that he can then use to impose by violence on everyone else. Not that kind of model, but he wants to resurrect Nietzsche's Superman as this kind of individual walking about through the theme park of history, trying on the different historical masks as simply variations on a theme, different styles of approach to history. And then that's basically the gist of the essay, and he ends by saying that the way out does not lie in choosing one or the other of these truths or styles that are in conflict. The main thing about postmodernity, the way Adamo sees it, is that we are entering into an age of a conflict of interpretations. And one of the shadow sides, as he says, of that conflict of interpretations is the possibility that it can lead to more violence with the rise of Huntington's clash of civilizations, in which we have the different civilizations falling back on their own cultural styles as absolutes and therefore fueling violence. He thinks that there is a possibility for that postmodernity could have an advantage, at least ideally, in terms of liberty and peace over modernity, because there is a shift now. There should ideally be a shift with this weak ontology that he talks about in other essays, in which absolute truths are no longer clung to, but simply different perspectives on the truth, different truths from different points of view, none of them privileged over any of the others, could lead to a model of tolerance and the flourishing of democratic ideals and a toning down of violence in these cultures, letting go. Religion, the Catholic Church could secularize, but without giving up its position as the great religion of the West, and so on. The softening of truth, the softening of being, he thinks, Adamo thinks, should and could be the necessary antidote to these clash of civilizations that has so far actually characterized modernity. And so that's the gist of the essay. But while I was reading it, it occurred to me that the kind of individual that he's talking about, this guy, this Ubermensch who walks around through the theme park of history, not in search of objective truths, but evaluating the different cultures simply by contrasting the different styles, is precisely what Oswald Spengler did in The Decline of the West. And so it occurs to me that there is a kind of surprising postmodern aspect to Spengler's Decline of the West that I think very often gets overlooked by contemporary critical theoreticians who simply dismiss him as old-fashioned, essentialist, foundationalist. I think there's a point being missed. And the point is that Spengler, as we'll move into here in the introduction to The Decline of the West, Spengler put forth a model of history that he called Copernican, and he contrasted it to what he called a Ptolemaic view of history, which is precisely the view of history that Adamo says here is consistent with modernity and which the twilight of metaphysics announced the end of, namely the view that the West is at the center of history and that history is simply an ancient, medieval, modern tri-scheme, like 3 steps that lead up to a Eurocentric model of history as the center and peak and pinnacle of civilization. Spengler dismisses that model. Even though he may have been writing in the modernist epoch, I think his sensibilities here are very postmodern, very relativistic, very consistent with hermeneutics. and that's merely a Ptolemaic model that sees everything revolving around the West, just as in the Ptolemaic geocentric model of the Greeks, the planets were seen as revolving around the Earth. And that his model is a Copernican model which gets rid of all such unilinear schemas. Any kind of dividing of history up always ends up by privileging the present, Spengler says, which is surprisingly consistent with, I think, what Vatimo was saying in his essay. In that this Copernican model sees history as a collection of cultures, none of them privileged over any of the others, including the West, none of them privileged to a unique access to truth, all of them relevant, all of them containing truths, philosophical systems, sciences, mathematics that are true only within and for those respective cultures. The Chinese historian, Spengler says, could be just perfectly justified in ignoring and in writing his history of the world, in ignoring the rise of Frederick the Great and Charlemagne. He would be just as justified in ignoring our figures as Western historians have been in seeing history merely as beginning with the Greeks and everything that comes before the Greeks, like Egypt and Babylon, and merely a prelude, a warm-up, with all the other cultures that are contemporary with the West, like India and China, confined to mere footnotes with an embarrassed gesture. I think Spengler's on very solid ground here when it comes to this critique, and it's a surprisingly postmodern. It's consistent with an age of the decline of Eurocentrism and the rise of the rest, who want now to voice their own points of view and perspective, at least, I would say, insofar as they're not busying themselves with converting to the modern religion of global free trade and democratic ideals, which I'm afraid a lot of them are doing, and are not really spending much of this new intellectual freedom and tolerance on the part of the West in articulating their own traditional points of view. I don't find a whole lot of that going on anymore today in a lot of postmodern thinking and the thinking that has emerged in the decolonialization process out of these cultures. They are too wrapped up in competing with the West, India and China especially, to be much concerned with articulating their own traditions, which I think they themselves tend to regard as antiquated by comparison. Modernization, if you want to be competitive on today's global stage, you have to modernize, you have to industrialize, you have to take on electronics, you have to shift into the mode of real time, flash trading, all of that. So I think it's not quite the way Vatimo paints it, that these cultures are advertising themselves and their traditions, except maybe for a few examples like the Islamic fundamentalists. But anyhow, I want to move into a discussion of Spengler here. I don't think that he is a metaphysician. He is a metaphysician in the old-fashioned sense. He is kind of an essentialist in the sense that there are certain basic thought structures that someone like Derrida wouldn't tolerate for a bit. There are a number of polarities that characterize his system. And the first of those polarities, as we move into the introduction of it, the book came out, by the way, just for the record, came out in 1918 in Germany, just as World War I was ending. And Spengler himself was not a professional philosopher. He wasn't an academic. He was a high school teacher. He didn't like academics. And he spent all this time writing this book in his spare time. Eventually became so overcome, like Nietzsche did, with migraine headaches, that he had to live off a disability from the state, until he published Decline of the West, and then it turned into a big European bestseller. And it seemed to make sense out of what had happened, the madness of the Great War that had just ended. This book seemed to make sense out of it. So it became popular not just in Germany, but all over Europe, and it made him some money, and he was able to live off of that. So that's briefly in the briefest sketch in the background. The Nazis did like him. He didn't like them at all. He was not a racist and didn't care for their Eurocentrism at all. But they liked him because he was a conservative politically, and he saw the current situation, as they did, as a decline from original ideals that the civilization is gradually losing and falling apart. So as we move into the introduction here, which is what I want to do next, Spengler says in the opening sentence that in this book is attempted for the first time the venture of predetermining history. So we'll get into what that means later, but what he wants to do is provide a schema which he believes can be used to predetermine the future stages of the West. This is a type of thinking that is essentialist, which is absolutely anathema to postmodern types of thinking. Any kind of pretense to a prophetic or oracular mode is regarded as anathema.